Who is the greatest character in all of literature? And what is it that makes a great character? Today we're going to find out, because I recently asked members of the Hardcore Literature Book Club who their all-time favourite character was, and hundreds of character names poured in. I'll be responding to their rationale and sharing my reflections with you, and we'll be doing a reverse ranking of the top 20. We're going to discover the patterns and commonalities that iconic and compelling protagonists share. And at the end of the video, I will also be sharing my top characters, my personal list, with you for the first time. The characters I've befriended and fallen in love with most significantly over the course of my reading journey. Before we get into the list, a huge thank you to book club members. Our character discussion turned into one of the most exciting conversations we've ever had, and readers shared some really touching and inspiring personal stories, personal connections when it came to their favourite characters and what they meant to them. And if you would like to deep read some of the greatest books ever written with a phenomenal group and gain access to an expansive back catalogue of lectures, read-throughs and bookish discussions, in addition to our exciting current reads, then please navigate over to patreon.com/hardcore literature. Check out what we're reading and join the conversation. You'll be very warmly welcomed, and if you love great books, you'll be right at home. Now, let's get into the list. Okay, number 20, we're kicking things off with Sherlock Holmes, and I had to narrow it down to 20 because we had hundreds of characters mentioned, and there was so much love for all of these characters. I'm very happy to see Sherlock Holmes at such a top spot. He is an iconic character. And when we talk about characters in our real lives, when we say someone is a character, we typically refer to somebody who is eccentric, don't we? We're talking about somebody who has a very distinct and unique set of personality traits. And this is true in the literary world too. Sherlock Holmes is a character, as in a protagonist, but he's a real character as well. Now, when we're thinking about the philosophy of great characters, it's worth bearing in mind that character reveals itself in action. If we're being Aristotelian, Aristotle said in his Ethics that we are what we repeatedly do. We are defined by what we do and also by what we say. And I think you know that a character is great when just saying their name immediately summons their behavioural traits and immediately summons specific phrases. When you think Sherlock Holmes, you think rigorous logical deduction, don't you? He is the greatest mind in Victorian criminology. And you get a very strong image. Perhaps you think of his distinctive hat, perhaps you think of a magnifying glass. Now, James Bond is like this too. Sherlock Holmes has become mythologized, and it's impossible to know nothing of this character. His reputation precedes him. Even if you haven't read any of the stories, you know who he is. And you can tell that someone has become mythologized when misquotations attributed to them are passed around. Elementary, my dear Watson. That's the phrase that comes to mind for Sherlock Holmes, but he didn't actually say this. He did say elementary, but the elementary, my dear Watson, is an example of the Mandela effect. What's really interesting with Holmes is when you go back to the original stories, you find a character who is incredibly complex. And currently, I am reading through all of the stories following the original serialized publication schedule. I have a facsimile edition and it's so much fun. I've been pairing my readings with the narration, the audiobook by Stephen Fry, which is absolutely excellent. Let's check out some book club reader comments. Rebecca says that her vote is for Sherlock Holmes because he is deep, complex and imperfect. And this is so important. We want our characters to be flawed. We absolutely love a flawed hero because it allows us to connect to them. And indeed, I think that Walt Whitman gives us the formula for great character creation in Song of Myself. He cried out, "I contain multitudes. Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself." We have another book club reader comment from MJ who says, "Holmes was my first introduction to the classics as a child. I'm a lifelong Sherlockian, not only because of the stories, but because of Holmes's complexity. He can be cruel and kind in equal measure and remains a mystery even to Watson. The fact that there are societies worldwide dedicated to the study of Holmes is a testament to our continued intrigue with him. I've been to the Sherlock Holmes Museum in London several times, and each time I have to remind myself that Holmes was not real, and I don't know any other literary character that has ever made me pause to consider this. This is a really important insight. The best characters are those that make us forget that they are characters. When we recall our favourite stories, they feel like memories and the characters feel like real people. And that's so true about Holmes. It does feel as though he is almost a historical personage rather than a protagonist. Book club reader Johnny makes a really powerful point about how great characters exist in tandem, not solo. Johnny asks, is Sherlock so great without Watson and Moriarty? Is Prince Hal from Shakespeare so great without Falstaff? Is Jane Eyre so great without Rochester? This is very, very true, and this leads us on to our next character in the number 19 position with Jane Austen's Elizabeth Bennet from Pride and Prejudice, which we are reading at the book club at the moment. And Pride and Prejudice is one of the top two books that make me laugh the most. It's Pride and Prejudice and Cervantes's Don Quixote. When I say Elizabeth Bennet, what other name comes immediately to mind? It is, of course, Mr. Darcy. Now, the really fascinating thing about asking this question was I noticed that some writers were responsible for more favourite characters than others, and Jane Austen was one of them. As we go through the list, I'll reveal which writers are the ones that got the most mentions. All of Jane Austen's heroines were mentioned as favourites, but Elizabeth Bennet got the edge. Perhaps there's some recency bias there because we're currently reading Pride and Prejudice in the book club, but I'm not too sure about that because I think Elizabeth Bennet is objectively one of the greatest characters of all time. And as John Mullen said, each of Jane Austen's heroines was a reaction to the one that came before. What does this mean? It means each and every one of her central protagonists is distinct and unique, and your favourite heroine tells you a lot about yourself. Elizabeth Bennet has Shakespearean inwardness. We can find a lot of Rosalind from As You Like It in there, we can find a lot of Beatrice from Much Ado About Nothing, and we can find a lot of Hamlet in her words too. Austen is up there as one of the writers who has channeled the most Shakespearean sublimity. Now, despite the fact that when I say Elizabeth Bennet, you say Mr. Darcy, I was actually quite surprised to not see Darcy get more mentions. Now, don't get me wrong, he was mentioned a fair few times, although I did not see a lot of mention of Heathcliff or Rochester. I was a little bit surprised that the bad boys of romance literature weren't mentioned more often. But Darcy's absolutely fantastic, and I found, over the course of our current reading, I found myself really relating to him intensely. One of the many interesting things about the history of Pride and Prejudice is the fact that today it has the reputation of being a woman's book, and that is absolutely the case, but historically men loved Pride and Prejudice too, and in the same way that women readers fell in love with Mr. Darcy, male readers used to fall in love with Elizabeth Bennet. She became the ideal of womanhood in the Victorian era, and indeed, the medical corps during the First World War actually prescribed copies of Pride and Prejudice to traumatised soldiers because the characters reminded them of home, and they found that Jane Austen was one of the most therapeutic writers, so they stocked all the hospital libraries with her works. Let's see what book club readers have to say about Lizzie. Stephanie says that Elizabeth Bennet is her favourite, and in addition to the iconic opening line of the novel, one of her favourite quotes is this: "There are few people whom I really love, and still fewer of whom I think well. The more I see of the world, the more I am dissatisfied with it." I love this quote too, because at this part of the novel, Elizabeth is scorning Darcy. She doesn't know him well enough. She's just formed her opinion based on first impressions, and yet, ironically, she's sounding rather like the thing that she scorns. Elizabeth Bennet, despite her lively and jovial disposition, despite her playful nature, nature. Like her father, she delights in absurdities. Elizabeth Bennet is actually quite misanthropic. She's well suited to Mr. Darcy. Stephanie goes on to say that I like Pride and Prejudice because the characters live in a world that has consequences. And Elizabeth Bennet is a multi-dimensional character. That is so true. She's not perfect, but she stays true to who she is. Book club reader Helene says that Lizzie was the first character that came to mind because she has vividness and vibrancy. And she thinks of Lizzie purely for the sheer pleasure of being in her company for a few hours. And here we find another key to great characters. It is very true that characters are Rorschach tests, they're inkblot tests. In fact, they are literally inkblots, they're stains on a page, and we compose them in our minds. Great characters are reflections of ourselves, but over the years, I've come to appreciate the fact that great characters aren't just ourselves. We're not just spending time with a reflection. They are other people, and great characters teach us to appreciate otherness, and that is of equal importance to self-understanding. In fact, they're connected. You cannot understand yourself without understanding others, and vice versa. And so absolutely, yes, Elizabeth Bennet is good fun to spend some time with. Now let's go on to the number 18 spot with another character who feels like a real person, and a character that we like to spend time with, and it is Levin from Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. Like Jane Austen, Tolstoy is very powerfully represented when it comes to character. I have seen so many of his protagonists mentioned as readers' favourites. As many readers have said, it's actually easier to pick an author and therefore get their entire cast of characters than isolate any single protagonist, and I do agree with that. Now, Anna Karenina herself was a popular choice too. Many readers said that they identify with her, but they expressed hesitancy when it came to doing so. Readers felt a little bit shy, saying that they feel like Anna, or they've seen something of themselves in her. Now, Tolstoy's novel was our very first read-through at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, so it is a work that is very special to me. And indeed, the lecture series is there to stream on demand at your own pace, as is War and Peace at patreon.com/hardcore literature. But for years, I have heard readers say that they see themselves in Anna, and I've heard the same thing from Madame Bovary as well. And indeed, there is much of Emma Bovary in Anna Karenina, and there is much of their authors in both. Gustave Flaubert said of Emma, "C'est moi." But I believe that Tolstoy could have very easily said the same thing of Anna Karenina. He could have said, "She is me," although he was actually quite judgmental of his own creation. And judgment really marked the later stage of his life because he scorned his literary work, he thought his work was immoral, and he wished to be remembered for his philanthropic and humanitarian work instead. Interestingly, another strong woman character who received a lot of love in the discussion, who readers were also shy about identifying with or liking, was Scarlett O'Hara from Gone with the Wind. Fantastic character. My advice is this: never be ashamed of which characters you identify with. Own it. Reading is deep self-work, it's therapeutic, it's reflection, and character is often, at its heights, an externalization of our own self-understanding. I really encourage readers to open up a dialogue with these characters, have long-running conversations with them. You're actually talking to yourself. Have conversations in your mind, because what you can do is you can give them advice, and what you're actually doing is giving yourself advice. Vicarious living is powerful because it's not actually vicarious if you're doing it properly. Reading like this will absolutely change your life. Anna Karenina is fascinating because she has much of the Shakespearean substance in her too. She's got a lot of Cleopatra's infinite variety. But it was Levin that edged it over Anna, and I think we can understand why. We might say that Tolstoy is Anna, but Tolstoy is also Levin, most certainly. And the thing about Levin, and this is true for Anna too, the thing that readers relate to is their sense of inner turmoil, and this is where reading really does become therapeutic. You're in the company of people who are going through things that you're going through, or similar things. And as Edgar says in Shakespeare's King Lear, his troubles seem lighter when he sees the king afflicted by troubles. This is one of the reasons why we read. The social utility of tragedy is in its healing power, in its assurance that we are not alone, and that goes a very long way, especially when we are experiencing dark times. Book club reader Jensia says, and if you don't want to hear spoilers for Anna Karenina because you haven't read it, then you might want to skip ahead to the next character. Jensia says, even after reading Tolstoy's Anna Karenina several times, I never thought I could ever consider suicide. That was not until the last 3 months of this year. My thoughts had always been, what's up with the ropes and pistols, Levin? Well, did you know, around the time of writing Anna Karenina, Tolstoy actually had to hide ropes and guns from himself for fear of killing himself. He was incredibly depressed around the time of writing, and I think we do get that come through overwhelmingly in this masterpiece. Jensia goes on to say, and Anna, did you really have to throw yourself under the spinning wheels of an oncoming train just to make Vronsky pay for neglecting you? But this year, I broke off a romance of 8+ years because I felt like I wasn't getting the things that I thought I deserved. And yes, I still loved him. In fact, I do. I'm very sorry to hear that. Levin, like I, just had to go through the dark night of the soul alone and in communication with God. Gradually, the light starts to pierce the armour of our self-delusions, and like Levin, I've come to realise that I needn't be self-righteous, but just surrender to love. God's love and the love of those around us can bring us solace, and Tolstoy is a master of revealing every molecule of his characters in their angst. So though my despair and heartbreak had me on my knees, Tolstoy's narratives and characterization brought me a new understanding about compassion. I may not always comprehend what another person's going through, but I hope I will always grant them grace and mercy. That's a really beautiful takeaway and a really beautiful message, and I'm so sorry to hear that you've been struggling with that. Breaking off a relationship with one that we love is easily one of the most difficult things that somebody could ever go through. It's up there with suffering through the death of somebody, because a breakup is a kind of death. I hope you continue to find strength, and I'm so happy that you are able to draw spiritual sustenance from these works. That's why I read them too. That's why I'm such a huge advocate for deep reading the great books, because I really do think that when all else fails, these great works can really get us through some difficult times. And my imploration to viewers is this: if you're ever going through dark times like these, please reach out to someone. Let people know what is going on. Look after yourself. Know that you are loved, and know that you absolutely are not alone. Now, talking of dark nights of the soul, let's move on to number 17, and we have Milton's Satan. And I'm absolutely thrilled that Milton's Satan is here. He is one of the most influential characters in all of literature, and I think that's a key to great character: influence. Sometimes it's not about whether you like them, it's not just about whether you want to spend time in their company, it's about who and what they have influenced. And Milton introduced a seismic shift when it comes to Western literature. We can chart 3 significant seismic shifts when it comes to English literature in the form of Shakespeare, Milton, then Wordsworth. We very recently read through the entirety of Milton's Paradise Lost at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, and again, lectures are available to stream at your own pace at any time. And this was one of the most popular book club reads, and indeed it was a personal favourite of mine. The Paradise Lost lecture series was a real labour of love on my end. I absolutely loved and relished every single moment, and it's quite a thing to say that you've read Paradise Lost. It's quite a thing to have memorised your favourite lines, which many of us at the book club have done. Satan is a real scene stealer in that epic, though indeed I found in my latest re-engagement I was actually really drawn not only to Satan but also to Milton's representation of Eve. I found her to be a very complex character, very interesting. I was also drawn to the voice of Milton, the poet, the blind poet who lifts his blind eyes up to the heavens and implores the muse to make him pregnant with inspiration, with creativity. I'm not surprised that Milton's Satan is here. The greatest writers of all time, I have noticed, are those that wrestle with evil and personify evil. The greatest writers of all time have their own version of the devil, conceptualizing pure evil. And Milton, having learnt from Shakespeare's darkest tragic protagonists, I'm talking Iago, I'm talking Hamlet and Macbeth, forged one of the most striking and influential villains in all of of literature here. Percy Bysshe Shelley said that the devil owes everything to Milton's Satan. And this is so true because Milton read between the lines of the Genesis story and blew it up. He did a reading technique advocated by Ignatius of Loyola where you see and hear everything, you engage your senses, and he took scripture and he introduced so much detail, so much imagination. Interestingly, in Genesis, the serpent that tempts Eve isn't overtly qualified as the devil, though we take the serpent to be. But we do not get in the Genesis story a figure that is like the Satan that Milton gives us in his epic. And indeed, if you look at biblical conceptions of Satan, especially in the Old Testament, we don't get the vicious antagonist that we get in Milton's epic. We don't get a figure that's locked in combat with the Almighty. Indeed, if you look at the book of Job, Has-Satan, the accuser, is actually God's right hand man, and Has-Satan is carrying out God's work. This is not the case in Paradise Lost, which is a proto-science fiction or proto-fantasy work of literature that conceptualizes these really vivid and compelling battles in heaven. The influence is such that when we think of Satan today, we think of Milton's Satan. And the really interesting thing about this character is at the very beginning of the epic, we kind of identify with his defiance. He's been passed over for the Son of God, and he delivers these rousing speeches after raising impious war in heaven, and perhaps we sympathize with him because he is the underdog, but as we read on, he becomes more and more pathetic in his resentment, and we start to abhor him, and by consequence, everything he stands for. Book club reader Estella says, "When I was in college, I wrote a lengthy paper on Milton's Satan, not as anyone I can relate to or admire, but as an anti-hero of sorts who is a master of deception. Many readers find his character admirable and even sympathetic, but I personally think Milton may have written his character in this way to deceive readers." That's such a fantastic point. That's so true. When we read this line, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven," we can see that pride is his downfall. This is true too. The greatest characters have a sense of hubris, and that causes their descent, their fall from fortune, their fall from grace. Estella says, "Nothing has happened to Satan that he didn't choose for himself." This character has been really interesting to examine within the text of Paradise Lost, but also from a biblical perspective. Book club reader Yumi says, "Milton's Satan is a whole category on its own, because I've never quite come across a character like that, so compelling and charismatic." Book club reader Paul broke his favourite characters down into categories. He had most entertaining, most interesting, most relatable, and most aspirational, and I think those are really brilliant divisions. And in the most interesting category, Paul placed Judge Holden from Blood Meridian, Satan from Paradise Lost, and Mephistopheles from Goethe's Faust. I've noticed a pattern that readers who mention Milton's Satan are very likely to also mention Mephistopheles and Judge Holden, and also Voland from Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita. Book club reader Constance says, "If greatest means most influential, I'd pick Satan in whatever form he appears." So, absolutely, influence has to be taken into account when it comes to the greatest characters. Perhaps it's the number one thing to take into account. What is more important than influence? And we all know this today, what with the great respect that we have for influencers. Now let's move from a conceptualization of pure evil to quite the opposite, a character who is a shining light of goodness. At the 16th spot we have Dorothea Brooke from George Eliot's Middlemarch, one of my favourite novels of all time. I find it really interesting to try to figure out the Myers-Briggs personality type of your favourite characters. If you don't know your personality type, you can find out rather quickly at a website called 16personalities.com, and you can see which characters have the same personality type as you, and you may find that you're often drawn to characters who do share your levels of introversion or extroversion, your levels of openness to experience, and all the different traits that go in to determining where in the 16 personalities you may fit. I say this because Dorothea Brooke shares the same personality type as myself. She's what's known as an INFJ. She is introverted, but she connects to the world through her feeling rather than through her thoughts. And she has a very strong sense of intuition. I really love Dorothea Brooke. I think she is the embodiment of the idea that reform starts at home. Middlemarch takes place in the age of reform. Over the course of the 19th century, England had a cascade of reforms. This was a very exciting period of change. Now, it might have not looked exciting on the surface, but there was a lot going on, and the country looked very different from one end to another. Dorothea Brooke's protestation is that change starts from within. We must sort our own house, our own affairs out before we deign to change the world. Dorothea is what George Eliot referred to as one of the Saint Teresas of the world, the unchronicled, the unrecorded Saint Teresas, the ones who may not go down in the history books, but they affect change in their circle of influence. I personally find Dorothea very relatable, but I also find her to be quite aspirational too. There's one part of me that wants to protect her, and then there's another part of me that wants to learn from her. And seeing her psychological and emotional development feels like I'm seeing my own development reflected back at me. If you haven't read Middlemarch already, I encourage you to do so. I think it's the great English novel, the same way that Ulysses is the great Irish novel, and War and Peace, though there are many contenders, is the great Russian novel. And we have a book club lecture series that follows that masterpiece through, following the original serialised publication schedule at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. Reader Jessica says, Dorothea Brooke is a favourite of hers. I didn't like her initially because I related to her too much. I would say you're an INFJ too, no, Jessica? I've noticed this as well with characters that are too similar to myself. There's a little bit of resistance initially. My flaws are her flaws, Jessica says, and that was very difficult to read about. Over time I came to adore her for her goodness, but it definitely didn't happen in my first read. Yeah, that's interesting. So if you see a character that's very much like yourself and you bristle a little bit because they're a reflection of you, they're a little bit too close to who you are, that process of gradually falling in love with them, befriending them, accepting them, is the process of accepting yourself. So I think that's a really exciting part of deep reading. Reader Bronwyn has voted for Dorothea Brooke along with Jean Valjean, Pierre and Yossarian from Catch-22. And Bronwyn says, I suppose what they have in common is the struggle to adjust and reshape their lives to an unsympathetic society without losing the values they began with. And I really feel that. Now, at the number 15 spot, we have the inspirational Samuel Hamilton from John Steinbeck's East of Eden. Now, we spoke about influence in terms of literary influence, but what about influence upon other characters in the same novel? Sam Hamilton is fantastic because how he acts and what he says and how he orients himself positively influences the other characters in the work. For me, one of my personal favourite scenes in literature has to be the scene in East of Eden where Sam Hamilton and Lee and Adam are pulling scripture apart. They're focusing on the Cain and Abel story and they're doing a deep dive exegetical analysis. It's absolutely exhilarating to read through. East of Eden, by the way, which is the big read that kicked off the start of this year at time of recording, East of Eden ended up being one of the most overwhelmingly popular books that we have read together. And as usual, lectures are still available. Now, obviously, as I move through the list, there's part of me that thinks, what degree of recency bias is at play? Because we read this book together very recently. But do you know what? I actually think that when it comes to Sam Hamilton, that recency bias is not why he is on this list, because I have been hearing about the characters of East of Eden for years before we even read it together at the book club. And this is true for all the great characters on this list that we have encountered together. I think the reason we read these books is because they're great, is because there's so much love and admiration for them. The really fascinating thing about East of Eden is that Steinbeck interwove his own family history into the narrative along with his fictional repackaging of the Cain and Abel story, and Sam Hamilton is actually John Steinbeck's own grandfather. He's a working man's hero. He's an Irish immigrant who has come over to the Salinas Valley towards the end of the 19th century, and he may not have a lot of money, but what he does have in ample supply is morality. This is another aspirational character, and with a bit of luck, maybe we can become a little bit more like Sam Hamilton ourselves. If you haven't read East of Eden, I really do implore implore you to do so. Meet this character, he's absolutely fantastic. Book club reader Shane says that picking one's favourite character is like picking one's favourite children. That's so true. The character that immediately leapt to mind for me was Samuel Hamilton. I do believe that throughout our journey through great literature we encounter ourselves, but when I first read East of Eden I felt this connection to Samuel precisely because he was everything I wasn't at the time, and that's fantastic. This is a key to great literature, I think. We see great characters as emblems of what we can be, what we can aspire to be. Shane says, I was a lying, vain, ego-driven young man strung out on drugs and alcohol who thought the world revolved around me. I picked up East of Eden in the midst of a life that wasn't panning out how I wanted it to and hurtling toward disaster. The more I reread, the more he became every virtue I wanted to emulate in my life. Selfless, good-natured, tempered, and above all, honest. He's not a wealthy man, but he is rich in what Scott Heller called enough. The Epicurean wisdom of not lusting after more and more, but being content. As a young man, the last thing you want to hear is too much. Sam is a no-bullshit character, and I appreciated his unwavering honesty. Every time I reread East of Eden, which is my favourite book of all time, I not only feel like I'm reading great literature, but re-accessing how I relate to my family and friends. I feel as if Sam exists to show me the riches that might be gained by taking stock in the analogue, tangible beauties of this life. I love that. That's so beautiful. Shane says one of my favourite passages from this novel is when Samuel says, "It's nice for a mediocre man to know that greatness must be the loneliest state in the world." As an ambition-driven and fickle young man, to read that made me question everything I lusted after. It changed my life, and I'm grateful to Samuel Hamilton every day. That's so beautiful. Thank you so much, Shane. And there's another character at the number 14 spot who has changed readers' lives, who has helped readers through really difficult times, and that is Prince Andrei from Tolstoy's War and Peace. I told you that some writers were responsible for more favourites than others. Austen is massively represented. Tolstoy is massively represented. And I'll tell you who the other strongest creators of characters are as we continue on and when we meet their creations. But here we have two Tolstoy protagonists in this list. Prince Andrei is an incredible character. When I think of War and Peace and I think of Andrei, I immediately think of all the other characters. I think of Pierre, I think of Natasha. War and Peace is a sprawling epic, and it's one of the most rereadable books of all time, and it's really perfect for scriptural reading. You could read a chapter a day and it would take you a year, and the chapters are very, very short, but you could meditate upon the wisdom in each of those chapters quite endlessly. That's a good exercise to do. Now, Andrei, Prince Bolkonsky, if you know your Myers-Briggs, as I mentioned, I'm an INFJ, you might be interested to know that Andrei is an INTJ, and I love INTJ characters, I love INTJs in real life, because they're very similar to INFJs, except their dominant cognitive mode, their primary way of engaging with the world, is not through their feelings, but through their thinking. I love INTJs because they give me a sense of stable rationalism. I love how reasonable they are. There's a real nice sense of being grounded when you talk with an INTJ, especially if you're feeling dominant. Prince Andrei features in one of my personal favourite passages in all of literature, and that is the lofty sky scene. If you've read War and Peace, you know the scene I am referring to. And once again, if you haven't read War and Peace and you don't want some plot details spoiled for you, then I implore you to skip on to the next character. But the lofty sky scene. Prince Andrei has had these idealistic thoughts about what to expect from warfare, the heroism that's going to come out of warfare, and at the Battle of Austerlitz, he gets taken out of commission very early on, he misses all of the action, and he looks up at his hero. He's fighting him, but he idealises him. It's a really interesting situation. His hero, Napoleon Bonaparte, and he sees him suddenly not as a great man, but as reduced significantly in stature. He's not that great. He looks up at the lofty sky, and he has this epiphany, this revelation of what matters in life and what doesn't, and it's so relatable, and I have not been able to look up at the sky and not think of Andrei. Book club reader Pierre Bolkonsky noticed the marriage of the two names from Tolstoy's War and Peace, Pierre Bezukhov and Andrei Bolkonsky. Says, My favourite characters in literature are Pierre and André. Together they make up the perfect man in my eyes, the marriage of pragmatic intellect and the instinctive understanding of the world, nobility of character and a passion for life. I can't favour one over the other, but if you put a gun to my head, then let it be Pierre. Yes, indeed, and I have a feeling that Pierre will be making an appearance a little further down on the list. Pierre also shares my favourite passage, the lofty sky passage, which goes like this: as André is sprawled out, wounded on the battlefield, looking up, how was it that I did not see that lofty sky before, and how happy I am to have found it at last. Yes, all is vanity, all is a cheat, except that infinite sky. There is nothing, nothing but that. And even that is not. There is nothing but peace and stillness. Book club reader Mark says that André's inner character is one of the most remarkable and beautiful. His passage on love when he was nearing death is one of my all-time favourites. The image of his beloved, her smile and gentle eyes, revealed to me that true love is in the final lingering thought at the brink of life's end. Yeah, absolutely. People who have had near-death experiences say that everything ceases to matter. The only thing they think about is who they are going to leave behind. When you think you're going to die, all that matters is love. All that matters is who you love here. And that puts things in perspective. And we have a great reader comment from Jack, who says, my first experience with a character that powerfully influenced me was while in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. Though in the midst at a very young age of chaos like I had never imagined, I remained an avid reader and found myself in possession of War and Peace, translated by Constance Garnett. I became emotionally immersed in the novel in a way I had thus far in life not experienced, and from almost the start of the story admired and attempted to emulate Prince André. Though he was painted with heavy faults and numerous misguided aspirations, I looked upon him as being the man I wanted most to be like, and I felt I had found my hero to guide me in my journey from teen to young man. André was a thinker, and he was discriminating as to how he used available time and whom he would associate with. To me, he had purpose and mission, not externally prompted, but emanating from his inner being and directed toward understanding as much as a man can in life. When he was killed, I was devastated, unlike how I had been in my entire life, and he was but a fictional character. A close friend at the time, whom I was stationed with, said to me one evening, Jack, what's the problem? You look like you've lost your best friend. To which I unabashedly answered, and I remember this as though it were just yesterday, a character in the book I'm reading died, and I'm bummed about it. Literature is ever so powerful, and it can have an influence on our consciousness that many, I fear, never realise or worse, experience. That is such a beautiful story. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really do struggle when I hear war stories. I don't get emotional too frequently, but there's one topic that is sure to do it, and it's hearing about the emotional trauma that comes out of the battlefield. What's really interesting is I've noticed that those who have been in the military, I've noticed that soldiers, they say Tolstoy helped them, they say Jane Austen helped them, and this shows that this great literature is not mere escapism. This has a very, very real purpose, a very real healing power it can offer us. And I've noticed with the characters that we've enjoyed so far, for the most part, they're very changeable, they're very complex. Our next character, if you like Prince André, I think many who like André will also like this character. At the number 13 spot we have Edmond Dantes, or you may know him better as the Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. This was our big read for summer last year, and it was so much fun. Again, lectures are still available at patreon.com/hardcore literature. Edmond Dantes, at the beginning of the novel, he has his whole life ahead of him. He's going to marry his love, the woman of his dreams. He's just received a promotion, but enemies, backstabbers, they conspire to get him thrown in jail for a crime he didn't commit, and he spent 14 years in the Chateau d'If, unjustly, but whilst there he met a wise figure in the form of Abbe Faria, and together they trained, they learnt languages, they spoke about the great books together, and he managed to escape. And this is pure hero's journey, because we see that he is dead in a sense. He has an ego death, he dies and is reborn, and he builds himself up, and then he sets out to have his revenge. And book club reader David shares this great quote from the book: "It's necessary to have wished for death in order to know how good it is to live. That's a great key to unlocking that book. And this is so true. Anybody who's been pushed to the point of breaking knows the liberation that is on the other side. And so if you ever find yourself in dark times, just know that even if they go on for a while, and they typically go on longer than we're comfortable with and longer than we expect and longer than we feel is just, if you're in dark times, there is light and it will come. You just got to get there. And when he breaks free, he builds himself up, he reforms himself, and he sets about having his revenge. We see he's gripped by a monomaniacal obsession to bump off those who wronged him. But what's really interesting is not just the revenge narrative, and yes, there's a bit of vicarious experience, there's a little bit of enjoyable fantasy there. What's really interesting is that he has an inner quest and a journey of inner growth too. This is another key to great character. They have to want something with all of their might, but they also have to need something. And if you want to create internal psychological conflict, then make your characters' desires, their conscious desires, be in opposition with their unconscious needs. And then if you want to create external conflict, then put obstacles in their way and stop them from getting what they want and delay them from getting what they need. We understand Edmund's thirst for revenge. Who could blame him? But over the course of his journey, he discovers something that's much more important, and it's not an eye for an eye. Edmond Dantes is an anti-hero. Edmond Dantes is Byronic, he's brooding, he's complex, and he changes and he becomes good. And I think we really identify with that process of becoming better, of being flawed and rebuilding ourselves despite the injustices we are beset with. And talking of characters that go on exhilarating journeys, next at the number 12 spot we have Ishmael from Herman Melville's Moby Dick, one of my personal favourite novels of all time. Call me Ishmael. That novel begins one of the most iconic beginnings in all of literature, and we think, why? Why call you Ishmael? Who are you really? And of course the answer is Ishmael is us. At least that is what many readers who voted for Ishmael have said. Now, I recently reread Moby Dick. The power went out for a couple of days, lost all the lighting, all the electric, so I had to light candles, and I was reading Moby Dick by candlelight. I was also reading my favourite scenes from Don Quixote, and I find that these two novels are beautifully complementary. Melville is a Cervantine writer. He's also very Shakespearean. As Ray Bradbury says, Shakespeare wrote Moby Dick using Melville as a Ouija board, and that is so true. We can really see a strong Shakespearean influence in his work. But I reread the book recently as rain battered against the windows and a storm kicked up outside, and I really just lost myself in the story. And I don't know how many times I've reread Moby Dick now, but the sign of a great novel is that you can reread it endlessly and it will always give you something new. For me, I really just loved spending time at the beginning of the narrative with Ishmael and Queequeg and reliving their budding friendship. I really have a soft spot for friendships in literature. I love to see good friendships. And I think we can all relate to Ishmael's journey because we are all on a journey, or we are all overdue a journey. At the beginning of the story, Ishmael has gotten a little bit restless. He's spent too much time on land. Perhaps one thinks of Frodo delaying leaving the Shire, but adventure, even though it's scary, even though it's dangerous, is good for us. And Ishmael throws a carpet bag over his shoulder and decides that it's high time to get to sea. We're either in the midst of a perilous journey, we're recovering from one, or we're getting itchy feet for the next one. Those are the three stages of life. Which one are you in right now? Book club reader Joshua says Ishmael is his favourite. I've never connected with a literary character as deeply as I did with Ishmael. In the beginning of Loomings, when he details his damp, drizzly November in his soul, I felt a real connection. My 2 months I spent on the Pequod truly felt like I had made a new friendship in my life, and as I go back and reread chapters here and there, it's like spending time with a loved one. That's so true. That's what we want from these characters. Anne at the book club says, I'm loving Ishmael and Queequeg. Currently, if I could invite someone over for dinner, it would be Herman Melville. I love his unique perspective, humour, type of intelligence and non-judgmental approach. Basically, we're all savages. Now, I mentioned Frodo just a moment ago, and he did get a lot of mentions, but at the number 11 spot, we have a different Tolkien character, and Tolkien is one of those writers who is responsible for the most character names mentioned, along with Austen and Tolstoy, and I will reveal who else as we continue to make our way through. At the number 11 spot, we have Gandalf, and I absolutely love Gandalf. We have another INFJ example here. In addition to Gandalf, I've seen readers mention Aragorn, Sam of course, Frodo, Legolas, Gimli, Pippin and Merry. The great thing about Gandalf is he is pure archetypal sage. He is the wise guide that Joseph Campbell talks about in his Hero with a Thousand Faces. And I'm currently loving spending time with the cast of The Lord of the Rings all over again myself, because I'm currently doing a walking challenge in which I'm walking to Mordor to get rid of the ring with Frodo. What I'm actually doing is I'm logging miles in this app, and the journey's broken down into stages, and as you complete different stages you get medals. I'll show the medal that I've got so far for having gotten out of the Shire and made it to Bree, and I'm on the next leg of the journey at the moment, but you get a medal when you've clocked a certain amount of miles, and you can replicate how many miles were walked in the actual stories. So what I'm doing is I'm walking, but I'm also listening to a great audiobook. I'm listening to the Sorkin narration at the moment, and I'll also every now and then before bed I'll listen to the unofficial Phil Dragash narration, which blends in the film soundtrack. I've been rewatching the films, so I like to listen and walk, and I also like to listen and read simultaneously. It's great fun. Book club reader Daniel says that the first character that came to mind for him was Gandalf. He's a person of extremely high power and wisdom, and he could obliterate almost anyone in his path, and yet he still loves and cares for others. Yeah, that's really good. When people are strong but choose to be loving, that is a really admirable trait. He's definitely seen enough heartache and evil to be justified in bitterness, but is still hopeful. Yeah, this is something that we learn from great characters, is how to retain our hopeful optimism in the face of great evil. Daniel says, I think that in some form unites all my favourite characters, and my favourite passage has to be from Gandalf himself. I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf, and so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. I think that's one of the most powerful passages in all of literature. That's really soothing and guiding and healing and instructive. Daniel says on top of that, he's pretty whimsical, and who doesn't love that? That's so true. What I love about characters from English literature is they typically have a sense of whimsy about them in classic English literature. Book club reader Tim says, I find myself drawn to the wise elder characters. Bishop Bienvenu from Les Mis, Abbe Faria from The Count of Monte Cristo, Father Zosima from The Brothers Karamazov. I love Zosima. Actually, I love all of the characters you mentioned, Tim. Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, and so on. I think this tells you a lot about yourself, Tim. I think this tells you that you yourself are a guide. You are a guiding light. You are a wise, shamanic elder yourself in spirit. Tim says most of these are at least somewhat peripheral characters, but have such a positive influence on the main characters. I'm not sure if they qualify as the greatest, but I do aspire to such a positive influence on others, so they really speak to me. When you isolate the commonality of your favourite characters, you find your personal mission, and I think it's very telling when your favourite characters are all guides. So you have your vocation right there. Probably already know this. And it's a really good point about peripheral characters. So many readers pointed this out. Book club reader Johnny says that this is an interesting thought experiment because, as Ben says, literature is a Rorschach test, and I think this may be the ultimate one. Personally, Johnny's list of characters make him realise how he relates to secondary characters rather than the central protagonist. I wonder what that says about me personally. Johnny lists Lord Henry from Dorian Gray, Lee and Samuel from East of Eden, Sancho Panza from Don Quixote, Ivan from the Brothers Karamazov, Iago from Othello, also Watson, the Fool from Lear, Madame Defarge, Falstaff, and of course Gandalf. Yeah, this is really interesting. I have so many favourite characters that are peripheral, and yet it almost does them a disservice to call them peripheral, because it's like saying that they're not important when in fact they're probably the most important. Yes, the central protagonist is technically the most important, but where would our central protagonists be if it were not for the influential people in their lives? I think when I read Pride and Prejudice, Mrs. Bennet steals the show. Elizabeth Bennet's a great character, but you just kind of are taken in by all of the peripheral characters. Mr. Collins, for example, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. When I think of Dickens, although we see no single character from Dickens cracking the list, it was interesting to see that Dickens was one of the authors that was most responsible, along with writers like Tolkien, for the most names mentioned. When I think of Dickens, I think of peripheral characters. I think of Joe Gargery from Great Expectations. But back to Gandalf. Richard says that Gandalf's powers are deeper than ever shown, and yet his discretion and gentleness would indicate he was just a mortal and elderly man. He appreciates subtlety and deep time as much as the comings and goings of men. Above all, he sees the divine in the smallest of things and has unmoving faith that it is from there the dark will be forced to retreat. From Gandalf, a personification of pure wisdom, we move on to a personification of folly. Although this character is one of my personal favourites, and I would contest that this character isn't quite as foolish as he might initially seem, and I think he has a lot of wisdom to share with us. At the number 10 spot, we have Don Quixote. And again, thinking about characters not existing in isolation, when you say Don Quixote, you also think Sancho Panza, and many readers have pointed out that these two come as a pair, and I would agree with that. This mad knight-errant stuffs his head with tales of chivalry and then goes sallying forth into early 17th century Spain, tilting at windmills that have become giants in his mind. He creates a landscape peopled with fantastical creatures. He gives himself a mission. He becomes a character. This character becomes a character. He lives his own story and he writes his own story. And I think he chooses his madness. And I think there's a lot of wisdom to be had in that principle. Choose your madness. I believe, despite how mad and foolish he seems, I believe that the knight-errant knows exactly who he is, and I find that aspirational. And I actually do find Don Quixote very relatable, personally. I know that probably sounds a little bit strange, but I find myself to be quixotic as well. What I love about Cervantes' novel is that it's just a brilliant buddy story. It's just laugh out loud funny. It's filled with boys' humour. It's full of people vomiting and messing themselves and getting battered and bruised. And although there are some scenes that will make one shed a tear, ultimately I dip into Don Quixote and it restores me and it leaves me feeling lighter. Book Club reader Joe mentions 3 characters for his favourite: Ahab from Moby Dick, King Lear, and Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, because they are a pair. What do they have in common? They shake their fists at the sky in their own way. That's a beautiful way of putting it. Book Club reader Janie says, such a delightful character and one whom I identify with for better or worse. I'm completely with you there, Janie. I know that I am overly idealistic, naive and mildly delusional, and wonder at times whether the people in my surroundings see me as a bit of an idiot, lost in my own world. But I appreciate that Quixote is able to put a romantic veneer on everything that surrounds him. I agree. Seeing the world not as it is in all its gritty reality, but perhaps as it really ought to be in a more beautiful world. I really love that. That's so true. And if you haven't read Don Quixote and you want to skip a spoiler, then please skip on to the next character now. Janie says, I was so disappointed at the end of the novel when Cervantes felt the need to cure Quixote before his death. Ride on forever, my brave knight-errant. Yeah, perfect way of putting it. And at the number 9 spot, we have the other half of that pair with Sancho Panza. I completely agree that Don Quixote and Sancho Panza are a pair. It feels wrong to separate them, but if we did treat them as individuals, then I have seen that Sancho got slightly more votes as favourite than Don Quixote. Sancho Panza is the fool guy in this double act, isn't he? He takes a right battering and bruising. What I love about Sancho is he's down to earth, he's earthy, and he reminds me of so many of my family members. Book Club reader Caroline says, it's funny about Don Quixote. People feel such an affinity to either Sancho or Quixote. I am a Quixote myself too, and so am I, Caroline. I think I'm definitely a Quixote, but I understand wanting to pick Sancho. Indeed, I know I'm a Quixote because I find myself longing to have a Sancho rather than identifying with Sancho. That's so true. I get this with Prince Hal and Falstaff. I love Falstaff. I agree with A.C. Bradley that he is one of Shakespeare's inexhaustible characters, but I do not see myself as as Falstaff. My critical hero Harold Bloom he saw himself as being Falstaffian. I see myself as aligned more with Prince Hal. And if you haven't read Don Quixote already, then I implore you to do so. We have a lecture series at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. As you read through the book, if indeed you pick it up, I would love to know which one you identify more with, Don Quixote or Sancho Panza. What I love about these two is they change by virtue of talking to each other. Now, Shakespeare's characters are solipsistic, narcissistic and egotistical. They speak and then they hear themselves speaking, and that's how they change. Whereas Don Quixote and Sancho Panza change because they learn to listen to each other. So reading Don Quixote is an exercise in learning how to be a better friend. Now, let's go on to our next character. At the number 8 spot, we have Raskolnikov from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. And Dostoevsky is one of those writers that is responsible for the most characters mentioned. I have seen so many Dostoevsky characters mentioned. It's been wonderful to see such a range across his canon. I've seen Prince Mishkin was a recurring favourite. I've seen Stavrogin from Demons mentioned. I've seen all the Karamazov brothers, apart from Smerdyakov, mentioned. Father Zosima from the brothers Karamazov was mentioned too. It was interesting to note that Alyosha Karamazov got a lot of mentions, but Ivan was the most popular brother. What's interesting about the three brothers in that masterpiece, by the way, is that taken together they form a comprehensive whole. Ivan is the head, Alyosha is the heart, and Dmitri is the flesh. Now, Crime and Punishment, because Raskolnikov was mentioned over and over and over again. This was the second big read we ever did at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, right after Anna Karenina. And it's a work that I've very recently returned to, and I'm going through a new translation, and my goodness, I'm finding it to be such a powerful re-engagement. Dostoevsky really knew the dark side of human nature, didn't he? This is what book club readers have to say about Raskolnikov. Aaron says, "It's hopeless to provide any wholly satisfactory answer to the question of one's favourite character, but I may as well try, and my instinct says Raskolnikov. He's the fictional character who is perhaps the most like me, although Ivan Karamazov and Ladislaw in Middlemarch are his close competition. The epic battle between his desire to overstep the boundaries of moral law and his simultaneous horror at his own actions is what captures Aaron's imagination and sympathy the most." Book club reader Cams says, "I'm doing a deep dive into Crime and Punishment right now, so obviously Raskolnikov came to mind as the first character I love, and this quotation explains why I think I relate to him so well. Despite his recent pang of desire for human company of any kind, the very first word addressed to him in reality instantly elicited his usual unpleasant and irritable feeling of disgust towards any stranger who came into contact with him or showed the slightest wish to do so. Does he ever get over that feeling?" Cam says. "I like to think so, which means I can too." That's a fantastic way of reading. Chris says, "I gotta go with Hamlet. Pechorin from A Hero of Our Time, and 3 Dostoevsky characters, Raskolnikov, Ivan and Stavrogin. They are the most thoughtful, self-reflexive characters I've ever encountered, and they also share my rather unfortunate melancholic disposition." I have that same disposition, Chris. "Their inner monologues are just so unapologetically raw and honest. It's also very comforting in a strange way. I know exactly what you mean. Also, watching them debate their opponents is pure fun, especially Raskolnikov trying to outsmart the police." James says, "I must hand it to the character whom Dostoevsky allowed us to dance in the mind of, who allows us to peer into the nature of criminality and its all too familiar humanity, who defended his loved ones from the false accusations of other evil characters, and whose character to me is so well crafted that he's just too real to be fictional." Jeff says, "I keep coming back to Raskolnikov, and he remains a compelling character because he embodies the eternal human struggle with moral and philosophical questions. His journey from transgression to redemption forced me to confront the darkest and most hopeful aspects of human nature, making him a timeless figure, in my opinion." That's so true. The greatest characters are those that are not of their time. They are of all time. They capture something of the enduring, something of the human spirit. And speaking of someone who captures something of the human spirit, our next character at the number 7 spot is Pierre Bezukhov. So Tolstoy is very well represented in this list. Pierre was cataclysmically popular, and I think one of the main reasons is the fact that Pierre changes. Pierre is one of the most thoroughly changeable characters, not arbitrarily, however. He is thoroughly always in keeping with his true self. The paradox of our personalities is that we stay the same whilst changing. Something eternal about us remains, even though we might change our opinions on different things. And if we are sensitive thinkers and feelers, we want to change our opinions on different things because the world changes around us. As Ralph Waldo Emerson said, a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. So dare to be inconsistent if you want to remain true to who you are. I think we connect to Pierre because he's a bit of an outsider in society. He's at odds with common opinion. He's never quite in line with what people think, and he's a bit bumbling, and he needs to mature. When we read War and Peace, we feel like we've gone on that journey with him, that journey to maturation, and we grow alongside him. And of course, Pierre has a great heart. Book club reader Shelley says, I don't typically remember character or plot lines, and that's what makes rereads all the more enjoyable, but some characters stay with me though. Natasha Rostov and Pierre Bezukhov from War and Peace are two of those characters, and so are Lee and Sam Hamilton from East of Eden. I've reread both books numerous times and I don't always remember how the various storylines end, but I always remember these characters. They became real to me 50 plus years ago and remain in my heart. I love Pierre, Lee and Samuel for the same reasons. They're wise but still seeking. In their search for wisdom, they teach me. That's beautiful, and I think that is a formula for powerful character creation. Wise but still seeking. River says, I love Pierre's idealism, his emotions, his vulnerability. Yeah, his vulnerability. His stubborn ability to pick himself up from the many wrongs and difficulties that befell him or that he gets himself into, and carry on somehow. His kindness is somewhat rewarded in the end. Sure, there's a bit of camaraderie in him with me, but Tolstoy wrote him so well. I just enjoyed reading and rooting for him throughout War and Peace. Yeah, we want characters that we can root for. And we've heard a lot of mention of Lee from East of Eden, so now it's his time to shine at the number 6 spot. That's who we have, Lee, from my personal favourite John Steinbeck novel. With Lee, we get another example of a so-called peripheral character, but he's not really. What's really interesting is when it came to Elia Kazan's film version with James Dean, he removed Lee, he removed that storyline, and he removed Sam Hamilton, which I think was shocking because they really are the story. Those are the characters for whom I read. Yes, I like Cal and I like to see his development. I like to see them replaying, he and Aaron replaying their father's troubles with his brother, but I read for Lee. Lee is servant to Adam, and he is the son of Chinese railroad workers, and he has a very tragic backstory, a very tragic family story. He's one of the wisest characters, and he dreams of opening up a bookstore in San Francisco, but his love for the family that he's serving and looking after keeps him rooted in Salinas. But interestingly, when he goes and he finally makes his dream a reality, he realises, and this is really relatable, he realises that home is where the heart is, and he had been living his dream all along because he was in a loving environment with people who cared for him. When he goes and takes that journey, he realises that he's away from the people he loved, and he didn't really want to sell books. That dream was a nice romantic idealism to have to get you through, but what he really wanted to do was just read his books. And so he returns home, so he can do exactly that in the company of those he loves. I think we can divide great characters into two types. 1, characters who we want to be, and 2, characters who we want to have in our lives. And I think Lee is the kind of friend we all wish to have. If you have a Lee in your life, you are very, very lucky. Book club reader Holly says, I've learned over the years I love the peripheral characters more than the protagonists. This is a common theme. Samwise Gamgee. Lee. Bottom, for example, from A Midsummer Night's Dream. Nice choice. I could probably name a dozen more that I ended up caring about far more than the main protagonists. They seem more real and alive to me, usually, than the main characters. Someone I might know or wish to know. With Sam and Bottom, their earnestness touches my heart. Lee, oh, I'm simply in love with Lee's capacity to love, his devotion, his calm acceptance of the people in his world as they are without enabling their shadow selves. That's a great way of putting it. Let's hear it for the character actors. One of the things that I really love about Lee is he's responsible for uncovering the core message at the heart of East of Eden. He does this deep dive, extensive exegetical analysis with the Cain and Abel story, and he discovers the nuanced meaning of the word timshel in the context of this idea of ruling over sin. Thou mayest rule over sin. This is what God said to Cain. And what's interesting is in the wake of Cain slaying his brother, God telling him that he may rule over sin introduces a choice. This is not an imperative, it's a choice. You can choose to be good or evil. And that can be a very liberating, a scary, but a very liberating message. Now, moving on to the number 5 spot, we go from a really, really kind and beautiful and loving character to the complete opposite with Cormac McCarthy's Judge Holden from Blood Meridian. An absolutely terrifying choice. Judge Holden got a lot of mentions. He was very high up. I think he is one of the most frightening personages in all of literature. I've said before that when I first came to Blood Meridian, I tried to read it several times and put it down because the bloodshed was so ferocious. It was so all-consuming and sickening and grotesque. But I really do think it's one of the great books of the 20th century, and I highly encourage you to read it. If you haven't read it already, then we have a lecture series at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. I reread it again recently as Cormac McCarthy very sadly died. I reread Blood Meridian. I'm currently rereading The Passenger and Stella Maris. But Judge Holden is just this pure evil, this devilish antagonist who lusts for war, who lusts for carnage. He's tall, he's bald, he's violent, and he tells us that what unites men is not the breaking of bread, but the sharing of enemies. Judge Holden's philosophy is that war is God. One of my favourite passages of all time in literature comes right at the end of the book. And if you haven't read the book, then feel free to skip this to the next character. But it's the passage in which we're told, after all of the chaos, all the carnage and bloodshed, and all the murder, that the judge never sleeps, never dies. He just dances and fiddles. He dances and dances. And we get a sense when we're with Judge Holden that he is not just a single personage, but he is a vessel for the enduring power of evil. He does not die. He never dies because evil never dies. Now, from the number 4 spot, we're going from pure evil to pure good. And we've got Samwise Gamgee from Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Sam got so much love. Now, as I said, Tolkien was responsible for so many character mentions. Frodo got mentioned a fair bit too, but Sam was overwhelmingly the favourite when it came to The Lord of the Rings. Frodo is like an archetypical hero, yeah? But Sam is the character that feels most real to me. What's amazing about Sam is we see that there is no success without the Sams of the world. You do not bring the ring to Mordor alone. Book club reader David says, I was thinking Frodo, the humble hero, but Samwise is the beating heart of the Lord of the Rings. Kate says that Sam, along with Scout from To Kill a Mockingbird and Scarlett O'Hara, is her favourite because I love courage, determination, strength, honour and independent thought. While Sam was not the main protagonist, I have always seen him as the hero of the stories. Sam kept his oath to Gandalf and kept his friend alive. He showed every heroic characteristic and never doubted the purpose or their success. I absolutely adore this character and he might very well be my all-time favourite. Kate says that her favourite characters, like Sam, resonate with her because of their show of determination and the fact that they are authentic to who they are regardless of criticism or circumstances. When I was diagnosed with ESRD, end-stage renal failure out of the blue, and had my transplant, I don't think I ever doubted for an instant that I'd be okay. I didn't allow myself to have a shred of doubt or self-pity, except when I had 8 AM doctor appointments an hour away, I can't lie. I read and fell in love with each of these characters during my childhood, so I'm not 100% sure if they helped mould my determination or if I loved them because I already knew I was stubborn when I read them. That's absolutely beautiful. I'm so sorry to hear that you've been going through that. I hope you're looking after yourself. I've heard from a lot of readers who have found during the most trying circumstances, during the worst physical ailments. I've heard from people who have really come up against it, really have had a lot to contend with, that these characters have helped them persevere through their companionship, but through that reminder to be stubborn and to keep going, to keep plodding on and not to doubt yourself. I must say that you are an inspiration. That's a really beautiful and courageous example to set, and I really appreciate you sharing that with us. Okay, we're getting into the top 3 now, and at the number 3 spot we have Jean Valjean from Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. Jean Valjean is actually one of my personal favourite characters of all time. Now, I love every single character already mentioned ardently, but if I had to personally be really reductive and I could only choose a very small handful of my personal characters, then Jean Valjean would be one of them. Now, there's an argument to be had that in Victor Hugo's masterpiece, Javert is just as interesting as Jean Valjean. The antagonist of the novel is a very compelling personage. I absolutely love his development, but ultimately it is the burning personification of virtue. It is the beacon of good, and the character who demonstrates our capacity to change in the face of the most incredible hardship. That has captured the hearts of so many readers. I personally find Jean Valjean to be thoroughly aspirational, almost to a religious level, and I find that many of the greatest characters are Christ-like figures, and Jean Valjean most certainly is that. Book club reader Robert says that Jean Valjean is the only character in literature that has made me physically weep. Yeah. Victor Hugo really knows how to push the emotional buttons that he does. James said that although the question of one's favourite character is impossible and irresistible, and thank you for opening up this discussion. You're very welcome. Thank you so much for adding to it. 2 come to mind. One of James's favourite characters is Jean Valjean because he's aspirational, heroic. He transcends his shackles and carries the good of the world on his back. Despite wrestling with his inner animal in the beginning, Jean Valjean to me defeats all other characters who I've come across in terms of his choice to practice virtue. Book club reader Nicholas says, my favourite must be Jean Valjean from Hugo's greatest epic. There is something all-encompassing about Jean Valjean. That's a really great way to describe him. Great characters are all-encompassing. Nicholas goes on to say he grows again and again upon his past selves throughout the novel, as a criminal, Christian, benefactor, parent, and reluctant revolutionary. His struggle represents the tribulations many face to simply lead a normal life. In fact, most of his quest is trying to achieve that which most of us often take for granted. That's a really good point. A loving family, a safe home, and freedom from persecution. He's both a role model for what a virtuous person should be, and a reminder that being such a person is anything but easy. That's a really beautiful way of putting it. Mary says that Jean Valjean is one of my all-time favourites. Everything he went through in that novel still makes me shiver. Many of my favourite characters touch slightly on my own personal life difficulties. Along with Jean Valjean, Mary is thinking of David Copperfield, Tess of d'Urberville, King Lear, Michael Henchard, Helen Huntington, and Captain Ahab, to mention just a few. I seem to relate to the more tragic side of a character. And Martin says, Je suis Jean Valjean. Ha! Don't I wish? Well, I'm right there with you. I wish too. And at the number 2 spot, and these characters really were neck and neck, we have Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. Do you know, I must say, I'm not surprised. I'm very happy with who's made it so far up. I'm very, very happy. But I'm not too surprised. These were very popular reads at the book club. Jane Eyre, in particular, was one of the most popular works that we read together at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. And if you're interested in what the most popular ones were, or the ones that seemed to elicit the most excitement, the ones that I hear rave reviews about all of the time, then they are Jane Eyre, East of Eden, War and Peace, Paradise Lost, Moby Dick, just to name a few that come off the top of my head. I'm sure there are many more. What I love about Charlotte Bronte's book is just how revolutionary it was. Now, it can be easy for modern readers to miss just how revolutionary some of these incredibly progressive, forward-thinking women writers were in the 19th century, but they absolutely were. There is a constant cry throughout that novel for women's rights. It's not direct, it's subtle, but it is there. It's absolutely there. And Jane Eyre is such a great character because she has great integrity. We get another example here of someone who we wish we could be more like, and she's an orphan. And orphans in literature have always been very popular. It's very popular to have a character who doesn't have their parents. And I think that's because we can always relate to them, even if we're not orphans ourselves, because we are all castaways, washed up from the ocean of life, washed up on the shore. We're thrown into existence and we just have to figure it all out. And when we find someone who we are in sympathy with, when we fall in love with another, we think, brilliant, we have a companion to weather life's storms, and so it can be all the more difficult to stay true to ourselves when we're in love with another, but we know that we cannot go forward with the relationship. This is the thing. Jane Eyre stays true to herself. She falls in love with Rochester, and her behaviour with him is always directed by her integrity. This is what so many readers have found admirable about her. Sean says his favourite character has to be Jane Eyre because she has an emotional toughness and almost stoic-like ability to survive. I think we could all learn something about endurance and perseverance and forgiveness from her. Nigel says, I'm generally drawn to the underdog, the weaker, disadvantaged characters, those who are looked down upon by society, at least within the context of the novel. Jane Eyre, I think, is an amazing character from this perspective. I find her endlessly inspiring. Similarly, I find Prince Mishkin in Dostoevsky's The Idiot to be super interesting, although I need to spend more time with this one. Stacey says, I really love how Jane Eyre never makes ridiculous mistakes just to advance the plot and grows realistically. Stacey read the novel when she was just 12 years old and was delighted to see how Jane, even when she was a 10-year-old girl, how she was presented as having complex emotions, logic and stubbornness, traits not very often seen in children, especially girls, in mid-19th century literature. That's so true. What an amazing point. Book club reader Maria says, it has to be Jane. Charlotte Bronte captivated my compassion in a very unique way right from the start. Her integrity, courage and resilience throughout, her strength of character and the powerful plot twist at the end and selfless choice she makes. Norier says, my first thought was Jane Eyre. She has been with me for about 55 years. We've grown together, or rather, she has remained the same and I have grown by reacquainting myself with her throughout the years. That's such a brilliant way of putting it. I have strived to be as sure of myself, as true to myself, despite the challenges that life presents. Many times I have thought her too good to be true. That seems to coincide with a weakness that I may be showing. I have to remind myself she's fictional, so I admire her creator, Charlotte Bronte. And now we reach the moment we've all been waiting for. All of the characters so far have been absolutely brilliant. I loved them all so deeply, and they all mean so much to me. But now it's time to see the character that got the most mentions. And I'm very happy to see at the number one spot we have Shakespeare's Hamlet. Shakespeare was one of those writers, along with Jane Austen, J.R.R. Tolkien, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Dickens, Thomas Hardy as well. Although we didn't get any Thomas Hardy characters in this list, so many were mentioned. Shakespeare was responsible for so many different character names. Shakespeare has a pantheon of great people, not characters, people. We believe in their existence, their reality, their living, breathing people. Shakespeare, as Harold Bloom would say, invented the human. Before him, we didn't have characters that seemed like real people in the way that his great protagonists do. In the world of Western literature, the most influential texts are the Bible, then the complete works of Shakespeare. Not only is he incredibly influential, but he's endlessly rereadable, he's constantly cognitively challenging and emotionally overwhelming, depending on the play you're engaging with. When it comes to the tragedy of Hamlet, we really have our intellects put to the test. The Prince of Denmark is one of the most rigorous thinkers in all of literature, and he also has that quality where we forget he is a character, where we think we're talking about a historical personage, someone who actually lived. And I think it's very interesting that the most popular character is also someone I would vote for as the most objectively great character, not just subjectively but objectively great. Can't think of a character who's more deserving at being in the number one spot. Indeed, he's a benchmark for all other great characters. When we want to say a character is great, we often say they have have something of Hamlet in them, that we often compare them to Hamlet. In my most recent re-engagement with this work as part of our read-through of the complete works of Shakespeare at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, we're reading through the entire canon of William Shakespeare in chronological order, and you can jump on at any time. You can follow along with your own pace at patreon.com/hardcore literature. With my recent re-engagement, I really sympathised with the Prince of Denmark like I never have before. I saw his plight in a new light, and one of the really fascinating things about this character is we get a sense of who he used to be. This is just one of the many reasons why he feels so multi-dimensional, so real. His father is dead, King Hamlet, and with the death of his father, the old Prince Hamlet dies too. All of the other characters talk about who Hamlet used to be. We get a sense of who he was before the play opened, and now he has changed. He's gripped by existential angst. But he used to be very funny. He still is. He used to be quite jovial. Not so much, but it does come through. He's always been a rigorous thinker, and so we get a sense of a really lived-in universe, a really lived-in world. And he's one of the wisest and funniest characters I've ever encountered. There's this adage in theatrical circles that by the time you're old enough to play Hamlet, you're too old to play him. The interesting thing about the Prince of Denmark is that anyone can play him, and there are as many different kinds of Hamlet as there are people to play him, if not more, because his thoughts are our own thoughts. You read his monologues, his soliloquies, and you cannot help but fit it into your own life experience. Hamlet is one of the 4 inexhaustible characters according to A.C. Bradley. We have Hamlet, we have Cleopatra, we have Falstaff, and we have Iago. And the play itself, I like to watch a different production each and every year, but I also like to keep a copy of it on my bedside. I read it as a work of philosophy, and a book of poetry, and a theatrical work, and a piece of almost scriptural wisdom literature. The Tragedy of Hamlet is also my favourite Shakespeare play, or it's at my top spot. Let's check out what readers had to say about Hamlet. Doug says that he finds it difficult to justify any other character above Hamlet. He is intensely relatable, despite ostensibly being a member of the medieval Danish aristocracy. And this is key. The universal is in the individual. If you want people to really connect with a character, if you're a writer, for example, make them as individualized as possible and you will capture something of the enduring human condition. Doug says there are so many quotes to choose from in this play, including the obvious, to be or not to be, and each are as gut-wrenching and provocative as the last. Yeah, it's probably the most quotable work of literature, alongside biblical literature. Mark says, one of the greatest characters is Hamlet, maybe the first play of modernity, bringing to life a fully formed modern man. Readers and audiences for centuries have wrestled to understand his humanity. Vicky says, Hamlet is definitely one of my top choices. My favourite quote of his would be, "Oh God, I could be bounded in a nutshell and count myself a king of infinite space." That's my favourite quote too. I really love that one. Vicky says, I probably think about these lines once or twice a week, and I'm always overcome with feeling and emotion. Ginger says, like many others, I also love Hamlet because he evokes so many emotions: love, sympathy, frustration, melancholy, and more love. Jack says that Hamlet became a part of his psyche and has been a friend and mentor now for the majority of my life. Upon meeting him, I found I finally had been blessed with befriending what I had then come to respect more than anything else in life, a man of courage and great unsurpassed intelligence. 2 qualities that Hamlet exemplifies in unparalleled ways. Indeed, to this day I would assert that he has the greatest command of language, along with the need and drive to express the most elusive and difficult concepts, and I never read or listen to his thoughts without feeling blessed to have been made privy to them. Most wonderful of all is that I was able to observe him deal with the extremes that the human condition can saddle a man with, and in each scene react with a spirit and determination undeterred by the power of the obstacles before him. Brooke says, I love Hamlet because he leaves you with questions about himself. People are so complex, and while the play allows us to say many things about Hamlet, there's always a sense of not knowing him fully. Yeah, that's so true. There's no human we can fully understand. That's profound. We can watch their actions and get a good idea of the person, but there are always layers we don't see that drive them. Hamlet, I think, is a great example of that. You have an idea or a suspicion of why he does what he does or says what he says, but you can never really be sure. I tend not to like when a character fits too neatly into a personality type, or when they act as a symbolised stand-in with no real complexity. Humans are messy and complicated, and I like to feel that when reading a character. Wow, so there we have it. Some of the most popular characters, according to members of the Hardcore Literature Book Club, and we're only scratching the surface when it comes to the characters who were mentioned. If you want to see who else got significant love, then please navigate over to patreon.com/hardcore literature and check out the thread. It is one of the most riveting discussions we have had to date, and I absolutely love reading through the threads that come below the read-throughs and lectures and bookish discussions at the book club. They are as exciting and engaging, compelling and insightful as the great books themselves. Personally, I have a habit of reading through these brilliant threads over my morning coffee, and they really are so engaging. And there were so many characters that got so much love. This video could have been 100 hours long. We could really just keep on talking and talking and talking about our favourite characters. But as I promised at the beginning, I was going to reveal to you my personal list, who my favourite characters are. Now, I originally tried to narrow it down to 5, but that was difficult, so I told myself, go for 7. 7's a bit of a lucky number. That was difficult as well, but I tried to make it work. And I'm not putting these in any specific order, but these are the ones that come most readily to mind for me. And before I reveal my characters, I want to give credit to book club member Ellen, who made a prediction of who my characters will be. I purposefully held off on revealing my characters until this video, and Ellen said, I predict your favourite characters will be Sancho, Falstaff, Hamlet, they'll be high up, perhaps Anna Karenina, Dorothea Brooke from Middlemarch, Ishmael and Queequeg too. But I'm having trouble predicting your favourite Dickens character, do tell. Well, when it comes to Dickens, by the way, I would have to say Joe Gargery from Great Expectations, but I also really love Mr. Pickwick. I'm also a big fan of Esther from Bleak House. Sidney Carton from A Tale of Two Cities is quite fantastic. I was happy to see a lot of love for him. But when it comes to my top 7, here we go. So immediately a character that comes to mind is Don Quixote, and I absolutely agree that Don Quixote comes in a pair with Sancho Panza, but the thing I love about Don Quixote is his idealism. Yes, he's quixotic, that's where we get the word quixotic from, it comes from his name. But I love the idea of choosing your madness, choosing your story, your adventure, and making the world what you want it to be. The world is what we see it as, and he absolutely chooses his madness. There is something aspirational and inspirational in the madness of the knight-errant, and indeed Franz Kafka must have thought so, because he saw the true hero or the true central protagonist of Cervantes' masterpiece as being Sancho Panza, and he thought that Don Quixote could be a figment of his imagination. What does that tell you? I think we could all use a good dose of Don Quixote in our lives, in our characters. Now, I also really connect with Ishmael from Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Now, I also really love Queequeg. I think their relationship is beautiful. The Pequod is home to a real vibrant cast of characters, and it can be hard to narrow it down, but I definitely do relate to Ishmael. I love his irony. I love his sense of humour. Even in the face of life's difficulties, or especially in the face of life's difficulties, he's still able to remain jovial, he's still able to remain ironic, and I really respect that and admire that. That's not always easy to do. I really relate to characters that feel restless, and I used to travel extensively. I travelled a lot, so I really connect to that itching to get to sea, to throw a carpet bag over your shoulder and go have an adventure. But I also love the Shakespearean substance in Herman Melville's masterpiece. So those two novels are two of my absolute favourites of all time. And I also love how those characters were born out of difficult periods in the writers' lives. The character of Don Quixote, the character of Ishmael, kept Cervantes and Melville company through trying times. Now, who else do I like? I love Jean Valjean. I find him to be thoroughly aspirational, and so I was very happy to see how much love there was for Jean Valjean. It was a nice reminder that I'm well overdue a reread of Les Miserables, so I'm excited to spend more time with Jean Valjean and to learn from him. Let's talk Shakespeare. Now, this is difficult. Now, I do think Hamlet is objectively the greatest Shakespearean character, although of course that's very difficult to say because there are so many that are of his eminence. A.C. Bradley pointed them out. Cleopatra, Falstaff, Iago, of course. But we can add many more to that too. We all have our favourite Shakespeare characters. I like Rosalind from As You Like It, for example. But if I had to pick a character that I'd like to spend some time with, then of course I would go for Falstaff. Now, Hamlet always teaches me. I'm always learning something from the Prince of Denmark. He is an absolutely astonishing creation, and Shakespeare funneled his own psyche most prominently into two characters, Hamlet and Falstaff. One is the ambassador of death, to use a phrase from G. Wilson Knight, and the other is a personification of endless life. Give me life, Falstaff says, and I admire that. Having said that, however, I really relate to Prince Hal. I love the Henriad saga. I love seeing his evolution from delinquent prince to ruthless commoner king. I love that story. I love that character. And for that reason, though we might not put Prince Hal or indeed King Henry V into the inexhaustible camp of characters, I have to say, just for personal relatability, it has to be Prince Hal for me. But that's great, because if I'm Prince Hal, then I get to have Falstaff around. If I'm Don Quixote, I get to have a friend like Sancho. If I'm Ishmael, I get to have a queequeg. It's fantastic. Now, who else do I like? I also really love Dorothea Brooke, as was mentioned. Dorothea Brooke from Middlemarch. As I said, she is like a reflection of myself. When I spend time with her, when I spend time in Middlemarch, it's almost like watching my own emotional, psychological and spiritual growth, my own progression. And ultimately, I just love the ethos that she lives and breathes. Reform starts at home. What a fantastic character. Another fantastic character has to be Leopold Bloom from James Joyce's Ulysses, and I was happy to see that Poldy, or Leopold Bloom, did get a lot of love in the discussion. And I personally think that James Joyce has to be in the hall of the greatest creators of character of all time. We've said Shakespeare, we've said Tolkien, Austen, Dickens, Dostoevsky. James Joyce has to be there too. Did he have as many distinct and unforgettable characters? No, but the ones who are robust and psychologically complex are to such an extent that he has earned his place there. And I love Poldy, I love his complexity, I love the privileged and intimate view we get of his interiority that Joyce gives us. We know him thoroughly. We know him inside and out, and he's a character who slips on by in the world outside. We might not take notice of the Leopold Blooms of the world, but they have a very rich inner life, and so spending time with Bloom is a nice reminder that the people we meet in day-to-day life that we might not give much thought to are as fully and vividly human as we are. Now, to round up, I have a personage that I was happy to see get a lot of mention in the discussion too. And it might sound strange to call this figure a character, and I do personally believe that they were a historical figure, but I'm talking about character in the sense of what this person has become. This person is the template for so many of our literary saviours and heroes, and is a personification of ultimate good, ultimate virtue. And this person is not only something of a character in their own right that is incredibly influential, not only are they involved in one of the most vivid and compelling stories of all time, but they are a teller of stories too. They dispense parables that contain truths. This character is a storyteller. I am of course talking of Jesus Christ. So there we have it. Those are my favourite characters, and those are the favourite characters as voted for by book club members at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature. We're enjoying a really exciting reading season at the moment. We're reading, at time of recording, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. We're enjoying the plays of Molière and Shakespeare. We'll very soon be gearing up for the tale of Genji. I'm so excited for that, and I was happy to see that Genji got his fair share of mentions in the discussion as well. Great character. For summer this year, we're going to be tackling David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest together. Later in the year, we're going to read Dante's Inferno. We're reading Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon. We're reading Thomas Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd. We have a secret Dickens. We don't reveal what the Dickens novel that we read at the end of every year is going to be until we get closer to the time, although feel free to guess what it may be. And of course we have an extensive back catalogue, and it's really exciting to see which works readers are diving into, which lectures they're enjoying, alongside our current big reads. Thank you so much for watching today. Thank you for reading along, and please let me know, who is your favourite character of all time? Who means the most to you, and why? What do you love about them? I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you so much again for being here. I appreciate you, and happy reading. Bye bye for now.